Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Ancient Warfare Answers with me, Murray, your weekly fix of ancient warfare or ancient history to distract you from whatever else is going on in your modern life. You, of course, can ask us a question. You can comment on one of the videos or the podcast. You can send us an email at awa@carvanseraipublishers.com. You can send us a telegram, and any way you want to ask a question, you can. We're going to have a question in a minute. You can, of course, also back us on Patreon. There's 3 levels of support you can give: Legionary, Optio, and Centurion. Now, this question is another from JSoth 2675, and they ask, out of curiosity, if Crassus knew Caesar, then during Carrhae, why not build a heavily fortified camp the night after the first day, as Caesar may have done? If the Parthians don't fight at night and the army was comprised of 10,000 all-mounted troops, that seems like it would have made some sense. In particular, Crassus would have been able to make palisades tall enough and simply encamped another day, thereby giving more time to come up with a proper answer to the situation. So, the interesting thing about the defeat of Crassus at Carrhae against Parthia is, of course, that it destabilizes the situation in the first triumvirate between Crassus, Pompey, and Caesar. The defeat and death of Crassus then leads to the disintegration of the situation between Pompey and Caesar. That leads to the civil war. That leads to Caesar's becoming dictator for life. So it's a snowball effect. And so the Battle of Carrhae is fascinating for those reasons. It's also a huge disaster, and of course, later Augustus celebrates getting the standards back that Crassus loses in Parthia on the Prima Porta. So the fascinating thing is, even if Crassus knew Caesar and knew Caesar's tactics, chances are he wouldn't have done as Caesar may have done, because ego is involved, and probably the worst thing you could say would be do what Caesar did, and that would mean absolutely Crassus wouldn't do it. The other issues, of course, it's not just that Caesar might have made a camp. That's what Crassus's own commanders suggest, and he refuses. But there are several other factors that make what Crassus did not necessarily the worst possibility. Obviously, he dies, loses most of his men, so it was indeed the worst. But there's no real prospect of reinforcements or rescue. So delaying the inevitable in a way probably wouldn't have helped. He's in the desert. He's without water. His troops are exhausted. So rest may have given them some respite, but they still would be surrounded in a desert without water. And so a breakout, which seems to be what he's really trying to do, is probably the best course of action. Now, the big issue, of course, is that the Parthian army that meets him is not the main Parthian army. It's under the cavalry of Serena, I think it's a Sparbod, who's one of the commanders of the Parthian king Orodes II. He's only got cavalry, he's got heavy cataphracts and horse archers. And when they encounter Crassus outnumbers those forces massively, but he doesn't have as many cavalry. So what you've got with Crassus is you've got 28,000, between 28 and 35,000 heavy infantry, seven legions, 4,000 light infantry, 4,000 cavalry, and he's offered some help from the Armenians of 10,000 cavalry and 30,000 infantry, but he refuses that help. So when he runs into Serena uses his cataphracts and horse archers and essentially avoids contact, and so surrounds Crassus, peppers him with arrows, and Crassus forms a hollow square, which means that they're far less flexible and will be worn down, which is essentially what happens. But still, that isn't necessarily a bad idea. Probably Crassus couldn't have anticipated that the Parthians weren't going to come into melee combat with his troops. The idea of an entirely cavalry-mounted foe avoiding combat with an infantry enemy is not something we put in the 50s BC. It's something we think about with the Huns or later armies in the 4th century AD. So it's ahead of its time in that regard. The other issue, of course, is that Crassus stuck. His men are already in the middle of the desert. They're already exhausted. So waiting isn't necessarily going to help. Maybe some respite, but not a lot. His generals, as I said, do indeed tell him to make a camp, but he refuses. And we then have, some early psychological warfare. The Parthians are beating drums to make noise continuously so that they're putting, the Romans off, stopping them from resting and all that sort of thing. So we've got the idea that they cover their armor and then they uncover it so the glinting light intimidates the Romans, and all quite amazing, ahead of its time battle. So the horse archers surround, but they don't engage. Eventually, what you find is Crassus sends his son with 1,300 Gallic cavalry and 8 cohorts to try and drive off the horse archers. The problem becomes, of course, that as he pursues, the cataphracts engage and the horse archers cut off his retreat. So in that, essentially, the sort of mobile strike force of Crassus is eliminated, which really leads to huge problems. The other idea, of course, is that Crassus could outlast the ammunition of the Parthians. And we know that Serena has huge amounts of, basically it's a continuous supply chain of camels bringing arrows for the archers, so they're not going to run out. And so essentially the defeat and destruction of Crassus is inevitable. Now, as I said at the start, if Crassus knew that what Caesar would do, he would definitely not do it because, this part of the late Roman Republic is ego city. Crassus does have military experience. He has been a victorious general, but not for some time. His 2 big victories are the Battle of the Colline Gate under the civil war with Sulla, and then the defeat of Spartacus in 71 BC. So, this is almost 20 years later. And so part of what probably drives Crassus, he's the wealthiest man in Rome. He can buy another army even if he loses one. But competition and the sense that he needs to compete with Caesar, who's by that point been in Gaul for 5 years, and Pompey, who by far and away has the best military reputation of the 3 triumvirs at this point in time. Obviously, today we probably consider Caesar a better general, but in the mid-50s BC, Caesar's establishing his name, whereas Pompey's name is already established. So in a way, what Crassus does is directly to compete with the reputations that his other 2 triumvirs have. And so he's not going to do things the way they would have done them, simply as a matter of course. And so essentially he drives his own destruction, but then you can't say that he is, what's the word? He's not doing it without a clue. He does absolutely have a plan. It just doesn't come off and it's defeated. And I suppose in a way, a bad plan now is better than a brilliant plan tomorrow in that regard. So the idea of camping and waiting isn't going to fix anything because he's still isolated. He's still exhausted. He still has an enemy who refuses to engage. So even though the defeat in a way looks to be inevitable, the idea that it could have been improved if he had waited or done it differently isn't really made a problem. He's, of course, also conned by the Armenian advisor that he's given, who helped Pompey earlier, and he trusts Ariamenes, his name's, and Crassus trusts him, but he's in the pay of the Parthians. So he's basically being misled. So you can really put a lot of it onto him. But when you look at later Parthian campaigns, even the one planned by Caesar, and then if Mark Antony followed Caesar's plans, which is probable/possible, they do a different route. And, the idea of never being far away from water, of course, is important in Caesar's Gallic wars, and something that in a Parthian campaign is a bit trickier to manage. So I think there's a bit of hubris involved in the way Crassus thinks that he's doing brilliant generalship. He is being misled. He is turning down support and help, but all of those factors basically lead to his defeat. But not that his attempt at a solution couldn't have worked. If if he could have brought the Parthians to engage, if he could have caught up with the horse archers, he could have won because he outnumbers them 4-1. So it's just a matter that he's outplayed. The other aspects of his ego and hubris and all of those sorts of things play into what the Parthians do and what Serena does. So it's a remarkable battle in that regard. But I don't think, given what we know, Crassus could have done any better. And if he delayed, it would have just delayed the inevitable. I don't think he would have improved his situation at all. I hope that helps. Thanks for your question, JSoth. We'll see you again for another episode of Ancient Warfare Answers. Thanks.